subjection, alike, who remain outside the circle of grace, delivered to subjection. We are living distinctions. Systematic disposal of creatures deemed threatening or unfit. How easy it is for fear and dogma to allow us to demonize others, deny them a common humanity, to do unspeakable things to them. In a morally disenchanted world, cruelty and violence accompany the call for order, the need for security. But what might we feel if we could feel what we experience sufficiently? Reading Chauvet demands a radical change in perspective. She sets out to test the limits of decency, common sense, and even at times good writing. Words no longer mean what we assume. And isn't sympathy, sentiment. It remains much less comforting, more acute and unsettling. It is a way into the crud, not out of it. So I want to ask, and I ask this question having thought a bit more about Gallery 1 and 2 of this exhibit. Are we prepared to readjust ourselves to a conception of human life that turns our own reality upside down? With us, it's the real world that seems the immediate thing, and the supernatural world something above and beyond. But once in the precincts of Chauvet's fiction and the Hades she depicts, the immediate thing is as if the supernatural, for which, of course, supernatural would be an inappropriate term, and what we call the real, where injury is obvious and its meaning clear, no more than a symbolization of events in the world of ritual, where what is most incorporeal is recast as reasonable. A relentless acceptance of unreality is a necessary part of Haitian history and crucial to its mythology. Yet what at first seems fantastic is always locked into nature. Or to put it more precisely, in the form of a question, what kind of writing could give the color, shape, feel, smell of matter, dead or alive, the claims of the spirit? The management of what is deemed society's refuse draws distinctions between the free and the bound, the familiar and the strange, the privileged and the stigmatized. And this ongoing cultivation of human waste materials demands that we recast interpretation itself. Certainly in our classrooms, I always ask, in my classrooms, how can we shed the mantle of civility, consensus, and rationality just long enough to question the claims of decency? Does academic caution conceptually defang thought, reducing it, no matter how, or especially if expertly rendered, to a privileged experience that nullifies what remains alive and unsettling outside our conventions and characterizations? So let's think for a moment about the unreal rationality of a racism that depends for its power on the conceptual force of the superfluous, what can be rendered as remnants or waste or dirt. In the spectacles of sacrifice that concern me today, to be disposable is not having the capacity to be dispossessed, to be nothing more than dispensable stuff. And it's as if, and here again, the power of the hypothetical must be engaged, and also a kind of tension between the archaic, I think, and the modern, what we think of as old and what we admit is new. I want to turn just for a moment to the medieval law of the diadem, which obsesses me. Literally, it was a thing given up to God. It signaled forfeiture and power, loss and gain. It wasn't outlawed, the diadem, until 1865 in England, when the business of railroads brought it into severe contention. But it is none other than an object or thing that becomes endowed with intent and malice, and thus must be sacrificed or forfeited to the state or the church or king. But let us imagine that this thing-like thing returns in the shape of things that look like humans, but are really evacuated of all characteristics that make social personhood possible. And just at the moment that their life, the resistance is most present and visible, the startling early portrait of the bull by Wilson Bigot in this exhibit captures what this thing-like thing might be that is so filled with spirit. Different from the zombie, what thinks, suffers, gets destroyed in such bodies has been rendered fully inconsequential in one sense, but it's made to perform tremendous symbolic labor in the fictions that uphold the violence of legal language. It unleashes upon what I call walking meat an inflection of witchcraft that Chauvet understood as a subjection both linguistic and social. So what I have called the sorcery of law are, conversely, the rules of the Haitian loi, the gods or spirits of voodoo, depends on a reinforcement of control while giving the appearance of channeling a docility that is always fictive. But resistance is never shattered, it is only put away or forgotten, just as the gods for Chauvet are never gone, but shut up in a trunk and held tight in the mind. So I want to talk to you then not just about human disposal, but what tracks it, the turn away from the gods and from other creatures, whether personalized or depersonalized. I now realize it does not matter. I want to push beyond the residual humanism, as do the artists here in Cafu, that lingers in such a personalist dichotomy. The sites of disfiguration are installed in the scaffolding of the quotidian. Chauvet demonstrated again and again how strange, how irrational is the moment of reason, how much like ritual practice, turning the personality inside out to discipline the rawness of blood and sex, are the repetition compulsions of her characters, apparently private, but actually collective and always shared. And how often they take what others would hide or throw away and turn these pieces of matter, whether fecal or just rotten, into something to be cherished. So in seeking to understand Chauvet's rituals, I have come to see how her fictions are ever in league with ethnographic critique, not just what I once called literary fieldwork, but rather her assumption of taxonomies, or fictions, whether of blood or color, that count more than any visible facts. What many political theorists refuse to recognize, and I think Chauvet helps us to begin to think through this problem, is not only the attachment of rational agency to the magical, but most of all, that the fusion of the two, the fantastic and the rational, is never far from the values of enlightened society. How then could we demonstrate the insufficiency of the divide between ritualistic, the religious and magical on one side, and the juridical, the logical and enlightened on the other? In the answer to this question lies a possibility of reorienting how we think politically, and I want to suggest how we read fictions that subvert the safe humans of the safe havens of humanism, the ruses of sentiment, and the claims of moral status. So again, let us do a kind of mind exercise and rethink what we mean by natural by recuperating as convertible or mutually adaptable the natural, animal as well as vegetable, and the human, the juridical. For as I said at the start, there is no such thing as an apolitical natural history, and even the institution of slavery and, of course, voodoo, the ritual practice born of its terrors, had much to do with how the earth was imagined, its landscape, its flora and fauna, its animals. So I want to discern the power of Chauvet's La Folie, her portrayal of a kind of predatory animism. Predatory animism might have been the title, I guess, of this talk, that confuses substances, matter and mind, material and ideal, reason and madness. Instead of simply being critical of contemporary political reality, she urges on us a visceral uneasiness, as if changing us physically, forcing us into the fact that she describes. What is her answer to and resolution of the state of dread and injury and pain she forces us to confront? She evokes the terrors of Duvalier's totalitarian state and his personal henchmen, the Tonton Macoute. They are turned into the devils in the nightmare landscape of Chauvet's story. But she goes further. She asks us to imagine what the world would look like if it underwent a perspectival shift. And she crafts her writing as a means of seeing crosswise or otherwise, nothing less than a translation between ontologically disparate points of view. And this stance, again, hit home like a proverbial ton of bricks as I walked through the gallery here yesterday. The early artists that I keep returning to want to grant supreme intentionality to various and disparate entities of the cosmos. There is a strange seepage between subjectivities, human and non-human. But back to Chauvet's madness. Come with me into the room that is the scene of the final movement of her trilogy, the room that eventually houses 4 persecuted poets, a chamber pot, and a trunk that contains the sacred relics dear to the Loire or spirits of voodoo, the sacred syrup, clay dishes, candles, amulets, and the remains of offerings to the gods, left as a legacy to René by his black mother. Stink is everywhere, inside from the overflowing chamber pot and outside from the dead stacked in front of the church and from the corpse right outside the door. And the gods, buried but not forgotten, the part of the spirits envelope which they come and through which they can be manifest on earth, eating perfect presence frames the waste products we encounter in peculiarly salient ways. But the stench also comes from the bodies of René, Simon, and his brothers, Jacques and André. In this supremely embodied world, the stink wafts out of wounds that have not healed, clothes that are not washed, skin that is filthy and flea-ridden, are in René's case, as he says, born of a father so light he seemed white, skin of a rotten coconut, skin the color of a fart. The corpse lying outside the poet's door for nearly the entire story looks more like a dog than a human. Shrunken, this creature challenges the divide between human and not human, life and death. Narrow notions of the visible and the empirical are overtaken by the haunt that is the dog. Here is the exchange between Jacques and René. Jacques has just entered the room, which has become much like the closed trunk and is meant in haunting ways to be seen as interchangeable with it. Did you see the corpse, the one in the street, in front of the door? Yes, that's a dog. But no, that's Sandor, the one who runs the place by the sea. It was dark. I thought it was a dog. It is only at the end, when René runs out of the shack, possessed, some say, by his loi, another calls him rabid, that the creature crawling with worms turns out to be a dog and nothing but a dog. Or is it? And does the distinction between human corpse and animal carcass matter? The world of the vulnerable and the violated, Chauvet presents conceptually and practically as the creatureliness of all things. There are moments when the reader becomes uncomfortably aware that the boundaries of humanity are being tested. To feel uneasy in one's skin, to take up René's admission, is not only to wear what he calls a chicken shit color before a black commandant, but in his words to be like a transplanted animal that's forgotten its native country. And we too are mesmerized by an aura that is not quite human, not quite animal, not quite phantasmal. How do we understand this spectral vitality? Chauvet finds her ethics in making seamless such divisions as those between humans, animals, and even gods. What matters most in the non-hierarchy that she advocates is taking seriously the fusion between physicality and mysticism, between, to obey the terms of her transgression and madness, the sacred and profane. We know the force of the loi. We know their voices and demands and reproaches through René's remembrance and longing. Here I am, my nails scratching the varnish off my Latin education, clinging to the bosom of the superstitious terrors of my childhood. The experience throughout is purely corporeal, a surfeit of matter so extreme that it becomes mystical. A rat licks up the syrup of the gods. The Loire are thirsty. The offering of their syrup is given to Jacques. Chauvet evokes the radical materiality of voodoo practice, its concreteness, its obsession with fragments, the very things that we might think would hinder belief. And let us not forget, for Chauvet never does, the recalcitrance and readiness, the hunger of the loi. But they are not devils, the loi, no matter what the priest teaches. Instead, the killers of the state who terrorize and torture, and the regulatory policies and police power that accompany them are the real demons to fear. The history of Haiti that suffuses all of Chauvet's fictions is a submerged one, that of endurance by the peasants ignored or beaten, that of the insatiable gods, so much a part of the earth and sky that they lurk in every moment of beauty, remembered by René. The feeling of reverence for everything created, from waste to the unbeloved, to the birds above and the crippled beggars below, is inspiring. A refrain occurs as a formula for what I think fully new. It is between squalor and it's by René. Cowering like a dog or standing his friend steeped in the tense, the leavings of what was once his Haiti. He thinks and hears simultaneously the whistling of bullets and the sunny songs, the strident songs of island birds. And later, as he gazes at the putrefying corpse teeming with worms and the bodies stacked high outside, he thinks, I am gliding like the birds between splendor and squalor. Interstars here. And that is the fable that she tells and the history. What does conscience look like here at the boundaries of humanity? Let me go to the edge of our cherished humanism. Instead of a turn to religion, romantic love, or even belief, Chauvet conjures up a reservoir which all creatures from have let themselves off completely. My aim here is not to refer to some concept of relativism, but instead to reshuffle our conceptual schemes, to propose a resistance to the terms of our epistemological debates, and so to cast doubt on the robustness and transportability of the partitions they presuppose: body and mind, animality and humanity. Quite simply, we have to recognize how inhuman we are for opposing humans to animals. And I am not talking animal rights here. Instead, I'm trying to ask a question along with Mary Midgley. Why does a sense of unreality block our attempts to understand our moral relations with animals? I am reminded here of Hannah Arendt's attempt to save political action and political understandings of action from humanitarianism. She feared, she understood the cunning of any properly political project of humanity. She struggled with human rights talks, the language of humanity that has unexpected effects, such as denying the enemy the quality of being human. So what are the implications of a logic at the heart of an illegality that is moderated, legitimized, and reproduced by the humanitarian concern that is analogous, I'm arguing, to it? Legal directives join in the dramatization of social structure as moral discrimination cedes to penal injunction. Reappropriation and uprootedness, which we see so much everywhere now, put in question, again, what we mean by human in terms like human or humanitarian. UN peacekeeping forces in Haiti, and of course, the moral sensitivity of welfare bodies, non-governmental organizations, and often local charities, civil, secular, and religious, often provide the minimum conditions to keep alive defective citizens or non-citizen subjects. Because once cared for as part of a humanity, these except as abandoned individuals, ruled according to means. The dead zone, the violence of the civilizational, for Chauvet is always condemned as a hyperbolic personhood, whether represented by the men in black, the devils, or the elite that betoken a savagery beyond recognition. The rot so pervasive in Chauvet recalls Aimé Césaire's dunghill of civilization, conceived out of its own nastiness, then dressed up as if gilded. The nastiness remains the blemish that can only be cleansed through sacrifice, the deaths of Simon and Andre at the end of Madness. The management of rubbish ultimately always draws distinctions between the free and the bound. And this is a question of ethics, not history. Under the mantle of civility and reasonableness, the Haitian government, in league with foreign interests, continues its assault on those who are always hit with the kind of violence that controls everyday life, whether in the camps or evicted from the only homes remaining after the earthquake. The abuse of life, as Chauvet knew, is a lethal magic that relies on the claims of culture in order to guarantee its malignancy. But her way of thinking produces something new while touching directly on what is most sacred, most holy, most saving, even, or perhaps most of all, during the beating and torture of poets, the stoning of dogs. In concluding, I want to end just for a moment where my thought, and indeed I recognize more and more, my life began nearly 40 years ago now in Haiti, in the last year of the Haiti of Papa Doc Duvalier. I returned to Haiti on August 15th, 2011, a year and a half after the earthquake. It was my mother's Haiti that I carried with me. I had to keep it in mind since everything she knew has been destroyed. The neighborhoods of Bois-Vernat and Turgeot, where she was born and raised, are in ruins. Nothing remains of her school Sacré-Cœur. Walking slowly into my past, I returned in homage to her beauty and to know again the place that had given her what she treasured most in a life of disappointment and slow decay in Atlanta, Georgia. Beautiful. It was so beautiful, she told me as she tried hard to hold on to her memory and her mind. Haiti was always with her, though she denied it for most of my life. And the way she ate mangoes, walked barefoot in the dirt, and looked for lizards that once found she greeted with pleasure. I remember how my mother used to pray to the Virgin Mary, Je vous salue, Marie, pleine de grâce, le Seigneur est avec vous. She told me that God was expressing his love for a woman pure and without stain. But then she added, it's not like the Jablesse or she-devil who died for the sin of being a virgin. When I asked her about her childhood, she laughed and recited sayings yelled at her as she walked to Sacré-Cœur down the hill in Turgeot, where the nuns took away the girls' mirrors and then gazed furtively at themselves. Dogs were everywhere during my last trip to Haiti. in the streets or rummaging in the ravines turned into dumps strewn with garbage, running along with the chickens, the pigs, and the goats. The chickens scratch at the dirt, the pigs root in the refuse, the goats look on in a kind of wonder, while the dogs alone seem fierce with concentration and purpose. There is no let-up during these last days in Port-au-Prince. I was visiting a friend, and I kept looking at the dog, one of the most beautiful I've ever seen. It was a large Great Dane. It was a puppy who was being taught to guard the house. For now, it is left outside in a concrete place, a long cubicle, the length of the side of the house. And it walks toward us. And during the entire dinner, I kept thinking about this dog that was so severely an object of disregard. And after that evening, I realized that everywhere I went, I was on the outlook for dogs. It sounds awful, but for somehow, the dog became the whole life of the animal, and the ways in which humans were relating to their animals, whether strays or possessions, was remarkable to me. But the most remarkable sight was in the town on the road to the airport, amid the rubble. It was in a gully filled with rocks, and I looked at goats, chickens, and even a cow. A couple of dogs ran past the animals, and all of the animals still seemed to be in the countryside, somewhere far from the earthquake debris. It was as if they remembered in their bodies the bush, the shrubs and flowers, and it no longer mattered if they ate dust. Then I saw something that reminded me that there is no escaping what is man-made, what casts a long shadow over everything else. It is unnatural. The giant hybrid pig I had heard so much about sauntered toward the road. This pig carries a history of outrage in its body. In 1982, allegedly concerned about the threat of swine fever, USAID ordered the extermination of the entire population of hardy black Creole pigs, over 1 million. These pigs served not only as food for peasants, but money in the bank. White Iowa pigs, known as cochon blanc, arrived but were too delicate to be raised on the hard soil and in the heat. Some died and some ended up in the Protestant missions. They were cared for and then turned into booty for Haitians who turned their backs on voodoo and took Christ into their hearts. One farmer complained to me that white pigs were prize pigs, and the only way you'd get one of these four-legged kings was to walk away from your land and crawl into a white world. But now, as if in some strange reminder of the curse of color, the misalliance so feared by racist historians in colonial Saint-Domingue and after, a monster pig of faded black and darkened white survives. This dappled gray thing was born out of extinction, and it came toward me on the road, walking along with its baby beside it. So the Creole pigs are not gone, they're just changed. They have adapted to a new Haiti that always bears traces of the old. Let me just end with a few points just to remember as we all sit here today. Nothing that I write or ever write can capture people IDP camps in Haiti, where hundreds of thousands of earthquake survivors still live. Second, let us think about the presence of MINUSTA, the United Nations Stabilization Mission. Everywhere I saw men in combat gear with large guns in the backs of the ever-present white trucks. I recalled their arrival in 2004 after Jean-Bertrand Aristide was ousted for the second and final time. They arrived in Cité Soleil, one of the poorest neighborhoods in Port-au-Prince, an Aristide stronghold, and killed and maimed young and old, leaving them in the streets. Now I see them everywhere in the countryside, on the road to Leogan, where I first began my field work, in the quiet of the hills. The majority of Haitians have no illusion about their presence and the message they are there to convey. Assured me this is not help. They ride through the ruins and over the hungry. This is an occupation. And of course, we know about the cholera caused by Nepalese peacekeepers dumping their shit in the Artibonite, the longest and most important river in Haiti. Now, finally, I want to say that there are a number of rumors that while nothing is being built for the dispossessed, new prisons are being built, and they are commissioned by one of the largest private prison corporations, Wagon Hut. To conclude, our new global order distrusts large groups of people who have been displaced or depersonalized by disasters both natural and man-made. Perhaps distrust is not the right word, but certainly the treatment of the dispossessed, usually dark-skinned folks, asks us to think hard about proper terminology. What are the words that can capture the unconcern and neglect of what Gordon Lewis once thought of as the future of the Caribbean, the source of culture there, those he called the black-brown masses? What do we do? How do we speak of? And I'm sure we'll hear today answers to these questions. What do we do with those who resist, who remember the long tradition of resistance and rebellion that made Haiti the first Black republic in the New World, the only place in the world where slaves successfully broke their chains? Cynics are those more jaded than I, say that Haiti has always been corrupt, savage, or for some, more West than the rest. The anthropologist and historian Michel Rolfe-Trio, now dead as of last summer in July, early on described Haiti as the earliest testing ground of colonialism, and its excesses have always forced our imagination high and low, the pearl of the Antilles or the sewer of the Western world. Now, though pockets of misery are everywhere, by what was once the national palace, in poor areas and wealthy, what strikes me is how the locales of the displaced are always in plain sight, and they form a background to whatever is going on. In some company, you do best not to mention them. You will be ignored. For those who work in the camps, fight the evictions, or treat the cholera and other diseases that are rampant, they are real, and they signal as if in a deposit of history, the fruition of all the hate and the prejudice of both insiders and outsiders, the conversion of years of nasty rhetoric into the facts of death. History is always embodied and nowhere more than in Haiti. Force fit into the first world before anything like a third world ever existed, Haiti needs to be thought of through what has always been some special kind of modernity, but not an exclusive one. Where can one go, I ask finally, to find a history that can help correct the present? I've been speaking for the literary and for the artwork that is here as a means toward that goal. But the real question about writing in a belittered world, finally, is to perhaps give to the claims of our most spiritual lives and the demands of our emotional lives as well, the most sodden, even if dark, embodiment. That was Chauvet's goal, and I think it probably should be ours as well, to hunt out in the acceptable scripts of civility what is harrowing, what is spurred on by unalleviated greed. Greed never comes without an overlay of morality. Such is the anxiety of the powerful and the machinations of power. So our task today, it seems to me, is to engage our hearts and our minds through the force of Haiti, the seriousness and depth of discrimination in its history, its art, and its ever-adaptive and resilient ritual practice. Voodoo, though threatened and suppressed again now, as numerous places are being trashed, voodoo takes a stance to the world and life that upends our preconception. And most of all, its rituals dredge up the dead and the disregarded, and they prompt the return of everything that has been buried for so long under a tide of good feelings and bad faith. Thank you.
Now we're going to begin a conversation and then also allow time for you to ask any questions. I think that if Leah or Alex wanted to start.
Well, thank you very much, Colin. That was fantastic. When I was sort of listening to it, I mean, I've been rereading, which is actually, in my mind, one of the most inspiring books about Haiti that I've ever read. And I think I was really taken when you sort of talked about this radical materiality of voodoo practice. I think it's got a very, very complex relationship with the material. Imagination is possibly one of the sort of more powerful impulses of Haitian art. The material is becoming even more, if it's possible. What do you think is the sort of future of Haitian art as the sort of, as you said, there's a splendor in the squalor, as the squalor sort of overtakes the splendor, and in these very extreme conditions?
And I guess the most extreme condition is that in 1987, voodoo was recognized as a religion. And under Martelly's government now, I'm not sure what the most recent news out of Haiti is, but they are aiming to substitute or remove that allowance and put back into law what used to be called the anti-superstitious campaign, which was a way of getting rid of all practices that were seen as heathen. The idea that Martelly's government would bring in this formalized recognition of attacks on voodoo, just as we know so many missions are setting up shop in Haiti, is, I think, a real matter for concern. So I think that your question is a really important one, and as you more than anyone know, how much the radically material is inspired by a sense of the spirit that pervades every day, every hour of your life. I think it's at great, great risk. You know, the artists, for example, of Artistes Résistance that you'll see here are themselves, I think, the witnesses of and the most remarkable transformers of the world you're talking about, of increased dispossession and terror. But they have, I mean, what they are doing, I think I would have to say that the answer would be, you know, that it will, I mean, how can one say? But Haiti and Haitians in particular, the majority of Haitians, have always lived under a sign of, you know, foreign interests and the presence of their own elite, who made their lives very, very difficult, and yet the art
was produced out of the remnants, out of what remained. I don't know, I think this is open for real question, and I'm sure we'll hear from others today. For example, in your photography, which is so incredible, you capture something of, you don't want to use the word resistance, it's just too easy, but something of what a particular encounter with catastrophe on the part of Haitians might be. But I'm very pessimistic about the future of Haiti, very pessimistic. But I don't know if that answers your question. And I don't have an answer to, what might remain. I can't really speak, I think, to that. I can't sit here and
I do
talk
sometimes wonder whether or not one of the biggest threats to Haitian creativity is not so much the extreme conditions, but the sort of neo-colonial multinational companies like Digicel, which are the first companies treating the Haitian poor as capital-creating consumers. And I'm wondering, I listen now to digital Haitian radio, the level of advertising. So I'm wondering if that might have a bigger effect.
That probably really does. In terms of the art, Macy's and Donna Karan have a big effect as they do mass production and things, the reduction of Haitian art to mere exotica and a large level.
It's true.
Yes, the neo-colonialism, absolutely. I haven't heard the Digicel ads, so I don't know what they're like, but I can imagine.
They're a very aggressive company in terms of their advertising, and there's big worries now with the carnival, is they are handing out T-shirts and paying people to wear the T-shirt and not put on the costume. And I've heard in Trinidad, the same company has already sort of killed part of the sort of déguisement of Trinidad Carnival. So I'm very aware of this and sort of looking at it. But anyway, there we go.
Yes, there's also a hatred, a real hatred of blackness. This promotion of a certain whitened world. It reminds me what's happening in Haiti now of, what was so pervasive in Jamaica and became in Jamaica much more destructive of society than even Eddie Seaga's reign. What I mean is, more than anything a government could do, the media, TV representations of what was the desirable look, what was the permissible skin color, stance, all was coming from the United States. So that it was even worse than being taught, to recite in school that, what the snow looks like on the cane fields, which used to be 1960s Jamaica. But now it really was that to be recognized, to have a presence, you were, in some sense, expected to mime, become the image of beauty. You can imagine how alienating this would be. That's US images. I even find it very difficult to live through the onslaught of images of what the US thinks of as its ceremonial celebrity culture. But in places like Jamaica, and I fear now what you're saying about Haiti with Digicel, it substitutes also for the history. Because once you really begin to despise the revolt and the characters like Dessalines who claimed themselves and made that color black, in Haiti, where to be human is to be neg, that entire reflection upon what it means to be alive is being, I fear, destroyed. So your whole interior life is controlled by wanting to attain something, that is not you. It's a devastating neo-colonial practice, but I think we all experience that brand, maybe to different degrees, of neo-colonial life, true. Certainly the US.
Can I take you back to an earlier part of your amazing paper, which was complex, challenging, urgent, everything I expected, actually. And it's always been our ambition to see if we could find a central role for you in this project, both in this publication and over these 2 days. So very glad that's happened. And that's maybe when I think of the aesthetics of voodoo and what you say about Chauvet's writing, and about other dimensions of culture from Haiti, I think of the kind of proximity of the abject and the opulent, which I think is unusual from the perspective of European culture, indeed the European mind. And, I also feel this sort of category of, this political category of the abject, if that's a term you recognize as covering, terms like squalor and remnant and fragment and stench and so on, is very different from the political resources of the civil rights struggle, for example, in America, or indeed the Black Power struggle that followed it, whose emphases were power and beauty. Black is beautiful. And at the same time, I can recognize a kind of wider international anti-colonial, and in other ways anti-discriminatory political abject that's maybe common to someone like Aimé Césaire or Jean Genet, for example, particularly his anti-colonial writings, Le Nègre and Paravent. And I wonder if that's something you could unfold more, and whether that term abject as a sort of culturally and politically militant category is something you feel holds for your thought, your engagement with Haiti.
Well, thank you for that question. I have to admit it puts me in a rather awkward position. It's a term I refuse to use. I adamantly turn away from it, and so it, not for what it holds, but there's a certain kind of terminology that it makes me go a little wild. I think abject is one of them. At least as a professor, I think what happens is that you end up in classrooms where the term abject, once you use it, can become the thing that covers over everything, covers over anything discomforting. Like all theoretical terms that have been accepted by the academy, it becomes an alternative world that suppresses the world that you claim to be speaking for, and it silences those you claim to be speaking for. So I would rather think about the wrinkles or the textures, not to be fancy, about the remnant or the remains, but rather not use a term like abject, which seems to be a larger umbrella. I just don't like the theoretical use of it, I think, and so it carries that. Your question, I think, is very incisive about the civil rights movement in America and the Black Panther Party, I think of most particularly. Certainly the tools at the disposal, the legal tools at the disposal of the civil rights movement were very, very distinct from the kind of remnants and remains and matter that I'm talking about, that Chauvet tries to reclaim in her fiction, and that I try to evoke as the possibility, meaning for change, for meaningful change, much as the artist in Artiste Résistance used the remnants, the remains, to create some. One of the reasons stressing this idea of the remnant and of the remains is that I've been very obsessed by legal rituals and practices of law for a very long time now. And I realize now, having looked back on that work, that even though you think when you're writing about the law in a certain way that you're rejecting its worst excesses, there's something about the frame of mind that it allows that makes you colder or less attuned to the facts on the ground. And so I began to think about how I could think through another means of thinking or writing that would include so many things that are seen by our Western minds as not salient or enlightened or central to our concerns, and to take those things that are superfluous and somehow think through them to get through the histories that are hidden and silenced. And I think it's a good way in that the more I live with and think through voodoo practice and its real philosophy of mind, the more I recognize that we all have so much to learn from the approach. It's a ritual approach, but it's not a mystical approach to life that you might get if you spend some time with people who believe or who inhabit a space that is informed by the gods. So I do think that part of the conversion that I've been thinking about, which is the transformation of what we think of as everyday or useless or throwaway into something extraordinary or sacred, comes out of my experience of a ritual that through repetition and through faith can transform that kind of transformation. So I think I'm arguing, which the civil rights movement certainly did also, for a spirituality that comes along with a kind of practical change, a certain kind of stance. I don't know if that answers your question, but sorry about the word abject.
Well, I had a part two to the question, which is kind of, in a way, approaching a similar set of issues from a different angle, and that's around this kind of radical animism, perhaps, proposing for animism, proposing for Haiti, which it'd be good to understand better. And I raise this for a couple of reasons, really. One, there's a lot of contemporary interest at the moment in the art world, perhaps in particular, around animism now as a category, like a new kind of animism, particularly in the digital age. So a kind of renewed communication or blurring of the distinction between human and objects. So that's that. There's a big show called Animism, and we're doing a big show made by Mark Leckey in April next year. But then the other thing that I think makes it very contemporary is, and a bit counter a lot of thought around Haiti right now, is that in the last 10 years or so, since the bicentenary of independence, there's been a lot of attention in political philosophy given to Haiti as arguing in a way for its centrality in the experience of the Western Hemisphere on account of it challenging the revolutions of France and America and standing for, at least as a political model, the realization of radical humanism, and to bring up an idea of predatory animism and to bring up an idea of a protest against the use of life as a more general category that could cover animal, it could cover divine creatures as well as man, would seem to contradict in quite interesting and potent ways this attention around Haiti as the representation of a radical humanism in the way that France, after the Jacobin period, obviously failed to be, and particularly once Napoleon became first consul and sent an expedition of 30,000 troops to re-enslave Haitians.
Thank you. I should say that I don't mean to assign the terminology of predatory through it for those of us who are not in Haiti, or those of us who live called Western world. I mean, because I mean, one of the things that was the divide between Western and non-Western is itself so tricky, since, as I said at the conclusion of my talk, I mean, Haiti has been mediated through its bones with the colonial myths and modernity. But the question about, humanism and Enlightenment humanism, I think I have to say that I'm writing against the terminology that comes out of such a humanism. And I think part of the problem, when I say predatory animism, we immediately think, oh God, she's talking about magic and trees and devouring creatures that we don't want around. It's more of a kind of throwing down a gauntlet, I suspect, that the idea of humanism is so nice, and it covers over the true predatory nature of those who use such terms. And the idea of animism, yes, as you say, it really does capture, I think, the kind of seepage between things we like to keep separate, humans and non-humans, and divine and profane. But I think the predatory is a really important thing to think through. And let me give an example from Haitian history, which many of you certainly know in terms of history and history writing. Dessalines is the founder of Haiti. Dessalines is never really in Western mainstream accounts, maybe only recently, but it's quite astounding just to look at the number of books about Toussaint or about Christophe and the avoidance in the humanistic, enlightened West of Jean-Jacques Dessalines is, I think, itself a very important way into what I can't affirm but would pose as a question, which is, what is it about Dessalines that offended so many and for so long? Why is his bloodshed? And I think you'll recognize that these questions could be asked about many things that are happening right now. Why is his bloodletting so savage and the bloodletting of others not? In other words, who gets to be cruel? And I think that that's a really important question. So I choose the terminology of, predatory animism only to kind of challenge the comfortable, relaxed of the human.
Well, I mean, only just to say, I think I was always quite pleased and sorry of Dessalines. If there ever asked neighborhood, Dessalines, remnants ended up at St. Anne's, the road. Everyone is a Dessalines.
And
I think there's a local tailor who's Toussaint, and he's a bit like, typical, petit bourgeois.
Also, Papa Dessalines is one of the most potent Loire, or used to be. I don't know if he's, Let me ask you a question, since you many times to Haiti. What do you see of voodoo? What do you see of its practices?
Well, I think it all really depends on where you are. I mean, I used to be involved with flag makers in Bel Air, and everyone there was Ogu. And it really was very much Ogu. And then I got involved with Artist Resistance, and it's very much Gede, and I'm sure that for them, Dessalines would have become a Gede, So in a way, Dessalines, I think, can make his way into the pantheon in many ways. I feel that the hardest thing for me is I haven't seen any rural voodoo for a long time. So you can get very, very involved in sort of urban voodoo and see that as voodoo. I mean, now I just think the funniest thing is the fashion. Now I've seen celebrants, wearing their trousers really low, Calvin Klein underpants. Everything's in white. but they're just sporting that little gangster look now, and but they're still celebrants. So, for me, I would like to go back and spend some time somewhere in the Artibonite, and actually sort of to sort of connect with rural voodoo.
In Gonaïves, they do have a yearly still, what would it be, like a 3-day ceremony for Dessalines.
Whereabouts in Gonaïves itself?
Really, it's the entirety.
Yeah.
And it's it's the largest. And I was wondering, if that was still happening, or with the new crackdown, would that also be at great risk? That's, Edmund Wilson once wrote that voodoo would never, ever disappear from Haiti. It couldn't, unless the Protestants came. And he said, because without rum, the gods are not going to come. And now, we have this onslaught of the Protestant missions. And when I was last there, all I heard, really coming from loudspeakers, were the chants on Sunday morning. Certainly not anything, no signs of voodoo. And people seemed really uncomfortable even being talked to about it, except where I began my field work in Léogâne. There, the places that I knew, I think they're still holding very close to its practices. But again, I think that's one of the reasons that MINUSTA that those trucks are going through the countryside. They say it's for stability, but I think it's really also just to kind of create an atmosphere that is so fearful that people begin to self-censor what they do, because those trucks are everywhere throughout Léogâne, and it's one of the most peaceful spots you can imagine.
I mean, and have you got any sort of theories about what is the impulse behind Martelly's repealing of the law that protected voodoo?
I think it's, I have to say that I don't know, but in Haitian, I mean, if you look back in the history of Haiti, often these things come out of, certain kinds of foreign interests. People like Harrison and numerous writers who report for the New York Times, for example. Lawrence Harrison was with USAID. They make the argument that true progress can only occur if these savage practices are eliminated, that it's this retrograde way of living, the customs, that really makes it impossible to have a good Haitian worker. And that the only way that progress could actually set foot and people would be looking and thinking about quality, Giuliani, I always say, quality of life, is if voodoo would be erased, because it's those practices that are holding Haiti back from entering into the 21st century. So I think that it's, I think Martelly, with Bill Clinton there, they're dear friends. I'm sure that he wants his country to shed any last, shall we say, remnant of what might be seen as a negative shadow, right? A reminder that this is really a primitive country. That's my sense. My sense is that Martelly is utterly, and let me go on record, an instrument.
Mm-hmm. Do you think in that there's a sense, underneath it, a sense of fear that what could come out of voodoo would be some form of resistance?
Yes, voodoo is always resistant. And not only that, but it's so much a part of the land that many people still live on. Well, if you want to start agribusiness, this is something that Jean-Dominique understood. If you want to make sure that industrialized farming practices take root, well, you have to destroy the belief in the gods, in the land where they are, where they reside. And you have to also teach people that thinking about the dead and their ancestors on their land that they've had all those years doesn't matter. So yes, I mean, it's amazing, and there's so many ways of thinking through the ways in which voodoo practice is a daily discipline that links people to their past, to what matters most for those who have been dispossessed. It's also another kind of history of resistance that voodoo holds for many, in that it's lasted for so long and it survived through so much. What better conquest could you imagine if you have the U.S. Protestant mission conquest, and everybody's wearing white, and everybody's praying, and nobody's drinking. It's a much. You're wiping out, as Césaire understood. You're wiping out years of history, and you're wiping out the identity that matters to so many. I mean, I really do believe that it is through this new dispensation against voodoo practice. They call it and then well, colonialism is always under the guise of care, and I think you really see it with many of the missions that I've visited. Lovely things they're doing as they destroy the people's beliefs.
Are there any questions forming from the floor? If you want to, raise your hand, John. And there's a mic just behind you.
Hi, thanks for that. It was brilliant, really great, and greatly appreciated. Just one point about the suppression of voodoo, the current under Martelli. I just read yesterday, in fact, that an Ungan from Wakaiman, who was organising the ceremony for the annual celebration of Wakaiman, was arrested and is now in jail, and there's a campaign to try and that was under the auspices of the new dispensation against voodoo, so that's very current. I'll ask you, is a of hate the myth of cannibalism that was so strong during the 19th century, and if this enters into your thinking of predatory animism, or whether or not, just what you'd say about the role of the myth of cannibalism in the denigration of voodoo.
Yes, thank you. Yes, absolutely. Certainly, and there has been a great deal of writing about the campaigns against Haitians during the AIDS crisis because of blood. This whole idea of, well, whether we call it cannibalism or in the ceremonies, the idea of sacrifice, that blood is being drunk and therefore it's contaminated blood. This idea, you call it a myth, the idea of cannibalism and this predatory, utterly no-holds-barred consumption on the part of those who practice is really, really crucial. I think that one of the fascinating things, though, about the current campaign is that the business of sacrifice, I don't know if, I see that Maya Daren's film footage is being shown here. And she has, over 20,000 tapes sitting in anthology film archives that have never really been put together. But this footage is Divine Horseman from her husband put it together. And what's amazing is that whenever I show it in a class, the images of sacrifice are those where students really turn their heads and say, I'm not going to watch this. This is so cruel. And I guess, again, what interests me in that first gallery so much is the representation of sacrifice, the representation of the animal in sacrifice. And I think that the idea of cannibalism, like the idea of animal sacrifice, these two things are taken up by by humanist and good, well-meaning liberal folks to be cruelty. And so I guess part of, again, what I'm trying to think through in the way I'm writing or speaking is to go back to what we find most primitive and think through what those practices are or how we might speak of them. Because it seems to me, and this is going to sound really broad and rather, well, it is risky, I think, but it seems to me that once you can describe and label what is primitive, for example, sacrifice, you can then do anything, because and the power of symbols. Once you create a symbol or a metaphor for the primitive or the savage or the dispensable, those who are practicing cannibalism or animal sacrifice, you then have the perfect cover for practices, state practices that are far more genocidal, far more far-reaching, really pervasive and cruel, and have nothing to do with, shall we say, a belief in something beyond the self. What I mean is a religious belief, a faith in something beyond the self. What we are seeing writ large throughout our world globally is greed made manifest, nothing beyond the self writ large through the destruction of others that you have, to go back to your word, demonized. And that is why I think it's very, very crucial to begin to, I think through, in a very kind of, maybe even naive way, what to sacrifice an animal in Haiti, in a particular context that happens to be voodoo. And then you could, begin to reread the ways in which histories have been written in order to silence large groups of people, but more than that, in order to justify the ravages against them. So, I mean, it seems that the stakes are very high now. We are living in a really very scary, I think, a scary time. I just wrote a piece about Gaza, the most recent assault. And I do think that there's something that wherever you stand, and I am not against Israel, I criticize Israel. I criticize the idea that the kind of carnage and the kind of incredible destruction visited upon innocent civilians goes really, in the United States, rather unnoticed. And I think then that that is why one wants to recuperate maybe other kinds of ways into discourse. So that, you see, because we are also silenced by being taught, like, well, you can't really say this in a classroom. And certainly if you live in California, and I'm sure at Vanderbilt, you do have to be careful what you speak of, what you say. And the surveillance is incredible that's going on in the States. And all of this sounds so wild. I feel like, oh God, she's being paranoid. But Lord have mercy, it's not. It's all come to pass. But the horror is, I think, that in our typical way, of thinking, it's through dichotomies. It's through, well, I'm against terror, or I'm against terrorists, or there's always this either or, and I'm just trying to invoke a way of thinking that would be both and, so you could slip in the obvious, like the horrors of Gaza, without being called, an anti-Semite. I mean, these dichotomies work wonders, and I do think we want to kind of do a language of proliferation so they can't really say, you're this, you're that, and you can say much more and include much more in what we think about.
I think Millery has that.
Professor Diane, thank you so much for your talk. I'm really trying to sort of really formulate my question, but hopefully it comes out okay. But as you know, the discourse of human rights has been, it can be seen as problematic. It can be seen as Western in so many different ways, and I think that's sort of what you're tackling a bit. And I guess I'm wondering, in so many ways, it's also been quite helpful for many groups throughout the world, marginalized peoples, in order to sort of gain certain aspects of what they deem to be progress. And so using that language, that discourse of human rights has been useful at the same time. So I guess I'm been thinking about this question of, as you've been saying, thinking of the question of humanism, of human rights, of humanitarianism and humanitarian aid, and I guess I'm wondering, how do you begin to sort of find the distinctions for yourself between those different terms, and also just as you mentioned, the quest of thinking about the self. And it sounds like you were saying, and tell me if I'm wrong, that the sort of overdetermination or sort of neoliberal sort of thinkings about the self has been problematic so much that it sounds like that the discourse of human rights for you has become faulty. And so I guess I'm wondering about that sort of the tension about how people are able to, at the same time, in various different parts of the world, or in Haiti, oftentimes need to use that discourse in order to gain certain aspects of progress or certain needs fulfilled.
How do you define human rights?
That's something I've been thinking about, right? And so that's, for me, when I think about human rights, I think about notions of the individual, right? And how the individual begins to seek out ways of liberation. And it's extremely vague, right? But in many ways, I needed to be that sort of vague and broad in order to begin to encompass all the various different peoples who want to gain access to that language. Mm-hmm. So I know that's insufficient, but
yeah, I'll try to. I think the question is, first of all, I don't think that I would presume to speak against human rights in the way that you mean, in the way that you're meaning individual liberation. I think I'm speaking more specifically about certain organizations and what happens to human rights when certain organizations claim to offer it. And again, I'm thinking about certain NGOs in Haiti, and I'm thinking about, I think also, certainly in the southern United States where I live now, the way in which human rights organizations work within poor areas to help. Mm-hmm. When I said that the problem is somehow abandoning individuals to, in some ways, their own abandonment, I realize that the idea of human rights, of course, has offered and offers still the possibility of progress in the sense that you mean, in the sense of movement forward and out of a place that is dark and lost. Mm-hmm. But very often, the human rights ideal comes along with some kinds of practical help that end up harming communities more than helping them. and in some ways converting people who are very much okay in terms of their means of production, what they're doing and how they're living, and don't necessarily want to give up on their day-to-day lives, whether it be certain kinds of religious practices, certain communities, just the places that they're in. So I think what I'm speaking about is the way in which human rights talk ends up being used in order to cover for or be a mask over conditions of change that people might not want. Moving to cleaner, renewed neighborhoods that are empty of everything that had a past for those people, are, being in some ways treated as objects of charity. Very often, and again, this is so local, kind of on the ground, my experiences, both in Haiti and now in Tennessee, very often the actions that we see as humane and good give more pleasure to those who are offering the goods than those who are receiving them, that it becomes a means of kind of getting a good, lots of good morsels of good conscience for yourself. And so you are in some ways in this conversion of the person you're talking to nothing more than an object of your charity. I think it is a kind of reaffirmation of hierarchy that is very damaging to people in their lives. And then to the very things that are being subsumed. So I think it's probably a much more, local thinking through of what we mean by humane when we use it and it matters to us to use it. I also think that part of the thing that always haunted me was Giorgio Agamben in Homo Sacer has this really amazing passage that I have never forgotten, and I think this went a long way to making me, as did Carl Schmitt and Hannah Arendt, who both had difficulties with the notion of the humane or humanitarianism. Agamben says in this remarkable place where he's kind of taken to task the notion of the humanitarian, and he says, think of the portraits of the suffering Rwandan infant. And then he writes, it is only by putting the humanitarian into the inhumanitarian context from which it comes that you understand its true inhumanity. And I think that, again, he's talking about the uses to which the humanitarian is put, but also the kind of images of, how do you get to feel sympathy for? Well, as we know from abolition, you present images that allow you to feel sympathetic, and those are very often images of a reduced personhood. So that's basically what I'm trying to get at, and that is the true inhumanity.
Oh, there, Charles.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Diane, for a fascinating paper, and thank you for privileging Marie Chauvet's work there and explaining so clearly how a number of the key issues you were talking about can be illuminated through her writings. I'd be interested to hear a little more about the question of prisons, which you mentioned, and particularly the construction of prisons in Haiti following the earthquake. And as you said, it's difficult to know whether we're talking about reports or rumours here. But it seems to me to be a very evocative, concrete example of the insertion of Haiti into a new global order. And also clearly linked to some of the other issues we were talking about, the criminalization of everyday activity and the policing or even militarization of space. And I suppose I had two questions. One was the extent to which you could talk about the symbolism of the prison in Haiti, because prison construction clearly takes us back to the imagery of Fort Dimanche, but it also of Fort Dimanche, but it's also thinking in recent history. The prison is, when Aristide's ousted for the second time, that is accompanied by the mass release of prisoners from number of penitentiaries, which leads to sort of social repercussions which are quite alarming. So that was one part of it. The other part was to do with infrastructure, really, and your feeling about the privileging of the construction of prisons in the rebuilding of infrastructure, because that seems to me to have very interesting questions attached to it. And if, as you suggested, that this is we're actually talking about the private construction of prisons, that leads on to questions about the privatization of infrastructure, and which, as we all know, one of the challenges in Haiti is precisely the privatization of water, the privatization of basic utilities, which is in many ways an impediment to the recreation of any sense of popular sovereignty.
Yes, thank you. I do have a fact in the midst of the rumor. A month after the earthquake, GEO Group is the new name. That was Wagenhut Corrections, received a contract in Haiti, and it was rewarded through the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, through the Bureau of Immigration and Enforcement, for, euphemism has never been better, guard services. So that prison construction, the idea that a month after the earthquake, that contract was already signed, I think is suggestive of what I'm trying to think through. And you're right. It is the new, that would be the promised order. Let me go back in time a little bit. After Aristide was moved, there was on Colin, what's his name? Colin, our old general. Colin Campbell, thank you. Colin Powell. I have totally repressed his name. Powell planned for a few prison directors to visit Haiti. You probably remember that there was it was about prison directors who went to Iraq, Abu Ghraib. Well, actually, there were 4 prison directors. One I knew quite well from Arizona, Terry Stewart, who went to Iraq, and they were given the job to prepare Iraq for society. I love this. These prison directors were to reform the prisons to prepare Iraq for civil society. And Terry Stewart, one that I've written much about because he was the director of the Department of Corrections in Arizona when I began my work there many years ago. He wrote an article in Corrections Today about his visit to Abu Ghraib, and he said, there is no way we can have a civil society without a penal structure. It was Terry Stewart that Mr. Colin was sending, I refuse to say his last name, Colin Powell was sending to Port-au-Prince. Terry Stewart was going there, what to do? After the departure of Aristide? To reform prison structures. It cost a slight to-do. I was going to go there then in 2008 in order to write about Terry Stewart's resurfacing in Port-au-Prince, and Colin Powell decided not to do this. But it shows that as early as Aristide's removal, this idea of reformation of Haiti was going hand in hand with the building of American-style prisons, U.S.-styled coercion and containment. And, people speak a lot about the militarization of Haiti, with MINUSTA, but I don't think enough attention has been paid to the kinds of prisons that are being built and the privatization, as you say. I mean, prisons always seem to be the forerunners of social change in certain places, and I think if we were to look at what's happening within the construction, the great amounts of money spent on construction of prisons as opposed to the amounts of money being spent on the rehousing of the dispossessed from the earthquake, I think that says a great deal about what some feel the future of Haiti should be. And I do think your notion of, it is a global order. And we're not just seeing it, in Haiti. We certainly see it in the United States with the building of prisons. If you look at the state of California budget and you see that prisons are given probably over 5 times more money than the universities, I think you begin to realize where the emphasis is lying for people as they think about the future of how you can concentrate so much wealth in the hands of so few people and put so many others out of their lives, out of their homes, and do it. Do it well. Well, you have to have prisons, because then the civil society that they're envisioning is certainly one that will be more of a penal society. I also think the war on terrorism is interesting in this light of prisons, because it really is somehow the war on terror, it's as if you had a regime of war and somehow now you kind of pin a label on it that's penal. I mean, it's the idea of somehow having the penal regime as the constant state of warfare that will be permanent. And you will have receptacles, as Thomas Jefferson said. It's a wonderful quote. When he was thinking about what to do if slaves in the South should be liberated, he said in a letter, "We must find receptacles for that race of men." And so I think that globally we really are looking at the restructuring of civil society through the prisons that are being built. I know it's all so depressing. There's nothing to say.
Hi there. Your talk was great, by the way. My own work that I'm doing at the moment concerns how America secretes Haiti and how Haiti is repressed in the American imagination. And, continuing on from what we were talking about, I found it really interesting that you say that this contract for a prison was awarded 1 month after the earthquake. And I wonder if that is also a result of this fear that Haiti was at this moment sort of rising in the global consciousness. It was being propelled in a way that it hadn't been through social media and that sort of thing. And it was another mechanism of control, of continuing to suppress. I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, did you use the word seepage?
No, I didn't.
I'm sorry, at the very beginning, you were saying you were interested in...
Oh, how it's secreted. Yes.
Okay, so that's a form of seepage, right? I love the term, though, secrete. It's very, very interesting. But yes, I think that, I don't think it takes, any reading of what, in particular, the US and France and Canada have been doing in Haiti since Aristide was first democratically elected is quite remarkable. And I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to do an apologia here for Aristide. That's not the issue. The issue is that Aristide, Tititse, promised hope for so many, and there was a way in which Aristide's presence allowed for the kind of growth, not just in, let's say, grassroots efforts, but it was in a sense, his presence that allowed for a great deal of what some thought of as militant activity. In some cases, it could be negative, but there was a great deal of, there has always been a great deal of intelligence directed toward injustice by the majority of people in Haiti, to thought, thinking through of the daily practices, and brilliant, a brilliant analytic, really, of what subjection entails. And I think that certainly the U.S. State Department is aware, it was aware of this. That's why they refused so much aid to Aristide. Paul Farmer then wrote brilliantly, Paul Farmer, I say then, wrote brilliantly about what kinds of aid were being refused Haiti when Aristide was elected. And you realize that there's great fear, really great fear, on the part of those, it's the same groups that have always feared the majority of the people in Haiti having their lives in forms that they believe in, but also in some ways fearful of the, you don't want to mythologize the revolution, but you do want to remember that the fear that comes from the so-called civilized world comes from a remembrance of, over time, I think, Haiti and its possibility of radical change. I mean, and it goes, also in the 30s and 40s. You get groups of Haitians together, and a lot can happen. The so-called bloodless revolution of 1946. So that I think that you're absolutely right, that even just to build these prisons, to have them there, the fabric of containment before you, to go into the countryside and to erect these massive structures. That's the other thing that's really scary. I mean, Fort Dimanche, is in the center, in a sense. MINUSTA and these planned prisons are going to be in the countryside, throughout the places where the majority of Haitians still live, still do their work on their land, still have their gods. I mean, that's, I think, very telling, that the prisons are being planned for the rural areas. And MINUSTA, that is, I think, without any hyperbole, what is being planned in Haiti. I mean, for all of us, I think certain images, certain memories are the things that catapult us into force and energy. And, if you raise and remove certain things that are markers of your history and then erect in their place these receptacles, you do something to that very resistance and spirit you're talking about. I mean, the secretions cannot survive that.
I think we've got time for one more question before we break for lunch.
Let's ask a cheerful question, something good. One final great
we should end
positive up note.
Anyone? Maybe I could try and think of a cheerful question.
Given
that you were saying that you believe in the power of the symbol, and also you mentioned, I think, during your lecture, this idea that there is some reservoir that we could draw from. Does that occasionally, or in any sense, affect your pessimism about the future of Haiti, the future of us all, perhaps, that because the imagination and belief does have this power, that therein contains the possibility of resistance.
Excellent. Therein contains the possibility of resistance. Yeah, beautifully said. There is that reservoir. And I guess in my work, I'm trying to write, maybe speak, and think through with others we think don't have thoughts worth thinking with, what that reservoir is. It is extraordinary. You mentioned about what's happening in Haiti, but I'm thinking about, public education in places like Tennessee and even in the Northeast, certainly, what's happening in the United States and how it's affecting those people who can least afford to pay for their education. There has always been, it's always recognized. I come to believe this now very, very fully, and maybe there is room for joy in this. I mean, that really there is a way in which the very people who are being in some ways most reduced by the current regime are those that are definitely feared. And it's the forms of thinking that are feared. And Gramsci once said that we're all experts in legitimation. He was actually talking just about professors. So, but we do maintain the status quo, I think, very much through the way we teach or what we teach. And I think that the joyful thing is to kind of counter certain methods. But I think there's also a certain spirit of defiance in the classroom. I know for those of us who don't have tenure, it's not easy. Or crashing down around dissent. But I do think that there is a way in which something you can kind of sneak in, which really does help. The notion I began my talk with about civility and reasonable consensus, and it's a great silencing mechanism. Because many people aren't going to feel that maybe they're reasonable enough or they're enlightened enough to take part. So I think one thing is just to remove the idea of civility. Just erase it, throw it out the window. Consensus, forget it. Instead, conflict, collision, fighting, because I think it's a real time where a certain breaking down of what we call civilized practices and, what is the best word? I think not so much civilized, but polished practices, decent practices somehow have to be, I think, questioned. And so I think the really upbeat thing is what's happening with students and young people throughout. I mean, I'm enlivened by blogs that are written by very young people, in their 20s, who say much more and in much better forms than those who are being schooled in all the most advanced tools of the profession. So I think that there's promise, but it has to be more from the ground up. And I was always a guerrilla fighter, so.
Thank you very much, Colin. So as I said, we're going to break for I think, about an hour until 2. Do take an opportunity to have a look at the exhibition. And if you're visiting the city and looking for tips about where to get something to eat, then feel free to approach any of us who work here. And see you at 2. Thanks very much.